Hello and welcome back to Indus News with me, Usman Lone. Well, we begin this hour with our top story, and that's Brexit, as the UK Parliament has approved an amendment forcing Prime Minister Boris Johnson to request a 3-month Brexit extension from the EU. Conservative lawmaker Olwen Letwin's proposal got 322 votes in favour and 306 against. More in this report. British lawmakers have derailed Prime Minister Johnson's carefully choreographed plan to push his Brexit deal through Parliament by backing a motion designed to rule out a no-deal exit. The amendment has opened a window to push Brexit until the 31st of January in 2020. Johnson is legally obliged to seek yet another extension for Britain's departure from the European Union. But the Prime Minister says he will not negotiate a delay with EU leaders.
I will not negotiate a delay with the EU, and neither does the law compel me to do so. I will tell our friends and colleagues in the EU exactly what I have told everyone in the last 88 days that I've served as Prime Minister, that further delay would be bad for this country, bad for our European Union.
Johnson said he strongly believes that leaving the EU with the new deal is in the best interest of all stakeholders. He vowed to introduce legislation needed to implement his agreement in Parliament next week.
So next week, the government will introduce the legislation needed for us to leave the EU with our new deal on October the 31st.
Parliament Speaker John Bercow says he will rule on Monday if the government can put the Brexit deal to vote. Meanwhile, thousands of anti-Brexit protesters outside Britain's Houses of Parliament welcomed the approval of the amendment. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says Turkey will crush the heads of Kurdish fighters in northern Syria if they don't withdraw as per the ceasefire agreement. Turkey agreed with the United States on Thursday to pause its military offensive in northeastern Syria for 5 days. Speaking in Istanbul, Erdogan said he will discuss the deployment of Syrian government forces in the safe zone with Russia. He said Turkey will follow its own plans if a solution is not reached in his talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Earlier, Ankara accused Kurdish forces of violating a ceasefire agreement brokered by the US. Turkey's defense ministry said Kurdish terrorists carried out 14 attacks in the last 36 hours despite the ceasefire. US President Donald Trump says some European nations are now willing to repatriate ISIS fighters captured in Syria. In a series of tweets, President Trump said the situation in Syria is very fragile and both Turkey and Kurdish groups want a ceasefire. But US Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell attacked Trump's policy in Syria and termed the troop withdrawal a nightmare. McConnell said the retreat of US troops will allow both Russian and Iranian influence in the region to grow. US Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad says a political settlement in Afghanistan is in America's national interest. This is the first time Khalilzad has spoken about the Afghan peace process since talks broke down last month. In a meeting with newly appointed military chief General Mark Milley, Khalilzad said peace in Afghanistan will safeguard the US from terrorists. He said a political settlement with the Taliban would allow the US to reduce the burden of war and protect 2 decades of progress in Afghanistan. Amnesty International has released a new report documenting patterns of arrests and beatings by Indian forces in occupied Kashmir. The global rights body said all politicians, activists and even minors resisting the lockdown are being arrested. Amnesty International says every Kashmiri detainee interviewed said they've been either tortured and subject to inhumane treatment. It said the families and lawyers of the detained Kashmiris have no information about their whereabouts or the charges levelled against them. The Indian-imposed clampdown and communications blackout in the valley has now entered its 76th day. Peace talks between the Sudanese government and rebel groups have resumed in South Sudan. Earlier this week, South Sudan's President Salva Kiir volunteered to mediate the dialogue between Khartoum and rebel groups. The peace negotiations are backed by regional leaders including Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni. Government officials and rebel representatives said the discussions would cover political, humanitarian and security issues. Sudan's People's Liberation Movement called the initial agreement a great achievement. In Somalia, 20 al-Shabaab militants have been killed in a military operation in central Hiran province. The operation was conducted after the regional administration called for help from Mogadishu. Officials said the military operation was carried out between the towns of Jalaksi and Bula Bardi. They said 18 guns and other weapons have been seized from the militants. The operation followed several al-Shabaab attacks on Somali military bases last month. In Lebanon, 52 security officers gave them a 72-hour deadline to stop the obstructions in parliament. Prime Minister Imran Khan says Pakistan's economy is on the mend after a year of fiscal reforms. In a tweet, Khan said Pakistan's current account deficit dipped 80% year-on-year to a 3-year low in September. Khan said Pakistan's economy is improving because of a drop of imports and a rise in exports. He said Pakistan's position was further strengthened by an 18% rise in money sent by overseas Pakistanis. In the 12 months up to September, Khan said foreign investment had jumped by 111%. Well, we'll be back with more news from around the world right after this short break. Hello and welcome back. Now a recap on our top story, and that's the UK Parliament has approved an amendment forcing Prime Minister Boris Johnson to request a 3-month Brexit extension from the EU. Conservative lawmaker Oliver Letwin's proposal got 322 votes in favour and 306 against. Now for more on this, we're joined by our London correspondent Ollie Barrett. Ollie, thank you for joining me here now. So this defeat must be a major setback for Prime Minister Johnson.
It's certainly a hurdle that he would probably rather have done without. It means that the vote didn't effectively take place on his Brexit deal and will be postponed into next week. He wanted that to happen today. He wanted to try and win approval from the House of Commons for the deal that he reached with Brussels last week. It also adds extra scrutiny to his Brexit deal. He may be concerned about that. And it also gives the potential that some parliamentarians may, over the next few days, try and add amendments to his Brexit deal to try and add changes to the proposal that he is making, which would make things very complicated indeed. On the other hand, it's potentially not all bad for Boris Johnson. One reason for that is that he can portray today as yet another day, he will say, in which he has fought against Parliament which is trying to frustrate, he will say, the Brexit process. That doesn't hurt him ahead of a looming general election. At the same time as well, the numbers today, in terms of the vote in favour of the amendment that passed, are actually pretty helpful to Boris Johnson in terms of working out where he stands. Because if you take the MPs who voted for this amendment, who also say they will vote in favour of Boris Johnson's Brexit deal, and you tot all those numbers up, it does look as if Boris Johnson has an emerging majority now in the House of Commons of MPs who say they will back his deal when they get the chance.
Well, Mr. Johnson said he wasn't daunted or dismayed at this proposal, and he still thinks that this is the best deal for England and the United Kingdom to leave the EU at the end of this month. But what's the likelihood of that happening now after this vote on delaying?
It's really hard to predict, but he does say he still thinks he can deliver Brexit by the end of the month. You'll also recognise that the legislation that's been passed today and added to previous legislation now means that he's technically mandated Boris Johnson to ask the European Union to delay Brexit beyond October the 31st. He says he won't do that. Now, many MPs believe that that means he will be breaking the law, but it could be that one way of getting around this is that Boris Johnson will be forced to send a letter to the EU suggesting or asking for a delay, but at the same time telling European Union leaders very clearly that he doesn't want one, that he doesn't want them to grant him an extension. And we've also already heard from France saying that the presidency there doesn't believe that an extension is in anyone's interests. So the vote will come back again to the House of Commons next week and should take place this time. There'll be votes on the legislation surrounding it as well. And then Boris Johnson will feel that he does stand a chance of getting all of this done and dusted by October the 31st. But we really are running out of time now. So it's still possible, even if Boris Johnson gets his way with his Brexit deal, it's still possible he may at some point have to ask for a brief technical extension to the process.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, you mentioned that the EU doesn't want a delay. He said he doesn't want a delay. In fact, he said, I will not negotiate a delay with the EU, and neither does the law compel me to. Now, there's some MPs that think he is being compelled to by the law, but he's saying he's not. This is political chaos, Ollie. Who's in the right? Who's in the wrong here?
No one knows, really. There are all sorts of arguments going on behind the scenes, and also all sorts of speculation about exactly why it is Boris Johnson believes that he's not compelled to send that letter to the European Union requesting an extension. That's part of the reason also that there are some speculation that all of this may end up in the courts if Boris Johnson doesn't send a letter to the European Union requesting the extension that MPs believe he is mandated to request. Does that mean that he will be headed for a court battle in the coming days as well? I would suspect he would rather avoid ending up in the courts in the coming days while he's trying to get his Brexit deal through by October the 31st. So it may be that there's some other clever mechanism that Downing Street believes it's identified, or it may simply be, as I say, that Boris Johnson will request an extension but also at the same time say to the European Union, please don't give it to me.
Ollie, what can this man do to get everybody on board and get this deal pushed through Parliament?
Well, he's done a certain amount of that already because, as I say, it does appear that a majority now is within his grasp for his Brexit deal. What that has involved behind the scenes in recent days is giving out all sorts of guarantees to different parties from different factions in the Houses of Parliament. For example, he's been saying to some Labour MPs, opposition MPs from constituencies that voted to leave the European Union, he's been saying, look, I can give you guarantees on workers' rights, on environmental protections that you're particularly worried about. That gives them the cover, really, to vote in favour of Boris Johnson's Brexit deal. At the same time, he's been talking to Conservative MPs who are worried about the deal and trying to reassure them as well. There are specific matters for specific MPs in specific constituencies. He can suggest funding for bridges and schools and hospitals and things like that that the central government can help out with. There are ways of Boris Johnson bringing more MPs round to his argument, and of course there were some pretty forceful verbal arguments as well made in the House of Commons today.
Oliver, thank you very much for trying to bring a sense of normalcy to the chaotic scene of Brexit. We'll be back with more news right after this short break. Hello and welcome back to Indus News. Now, Israeli forces have shot dead a Palestinian man at an army checkpoint in the West Bank. The Palestinian Red Crescent said Israeli soldiers did not allow its ambulances to transport the body to the hospital. Meanwhile, Palestinian medics said Israeli forces injured 73 Palestinians during ongoing weekly protests. In Italy, thousands of supporters of right-wing parties have protested in Rome against the new government formed last month. Former Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini's League party spearheaded the demonstrations. The League governed with the Five Star Movement for 14 months before Salvini pulled down the coalition in August. After snap polls, Five Star formed an alliance with the pro-European Democratic Party to return to power. In Spain, the streets of Barcelona saw clashes break out between protesters and police. Catalan demonstrators are protesting against the sentencing of Catalan separatist leaders. Hundreds of protesters set barricades on fire and threw stones at security forces on the 5th day of clashes. Masked youths blocked a road close to the city's police headquarters, setting large garbage bins on fire. In response, the police fired rubber bullets and tear gas to disperse the crowd. 128 people have been arrested since the protests started. The United States has imposed new sanctions on Cuba over its human rights record and support for Venezuela's government. In a statement, the U.S. Commerce Department said it is revoking licenses for U.S. companies leasing aircraft to Cuban carriers. It said the department will deny future applications for aircraft leases. U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross said the Cuban government must cease their destructive behavior at home and abroad. Responding, Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel rejected the decision, calling it inhumane and unfair. In Chile, a state of emergency has been declared in the capital, Santiago, after violent protests broke out. The demonstrations were sparked by a hike in metro ticket prices. Protesters, many of them students, jumped turnstiles and attacked underground stations. The riots left a building engulfed in flames and Santiago's metro system closed down. Anti-riot police used tear gas and batons against some protesters. President Sebastián Piñera said he would invoke a special state security law to prosecute criminals responsible for the damage. In Russia, 15 people have died after a dam collapsed in Siberia. The Russian Emergencies Ministry said 15 other people are still missing. The ministry said the dam located at a gold mine in the Krasnoyarsk region collapsed this morning, and 2 temporary dormitories at the site were also flooded. Rescue officials said about 270 people were working at the site. They've warned the death toll may rise. In Mexico, breathtaking photographs of the Popocatépetl volcano have been taken from an aeroplane. The volcano sits at a height of 5,426 meters high and is the second highest mountain in Mexico. The volcano was dormant for decades until its eruption in the early 1990s. Well, Spain is one of the world's top exporters of falcons, and according to the International Trade in Endangered Species, it exported over 2,800 specimens last year. Most of the Spanish falcons are exported to the Middle East, where people buy them for racing or hunting. More in this report.
For centuries, the art of falconry has been a prestigious tradition within Arab society. Today, most of these formidable predators come from Spain. In upper-class Gulf societies, Spanish hunters are worth a fortune, with buyers sometimes shelling out tens of thousands of euros per bird. Such birds are raised in customized air-conditioned facilities where their trainers come and select the best specimen.
You have customers who buy falcons for the princess teams, so you have to be careful what you sell and who you sell it to. You can't sell a bird half as good as this one to a princess team, simply because you close the doors of a market for yourself.
In Spain, falcons also enjoy the advantage of hot and dry climate. They utilize the weather to be acclimatized to the hotter temperatures they will experience in the Gulf.
The Spain weather similar to Al Gulf, about temperature, humidity, similar. When falcon bring it from Spain to Qatar, they not have feel change a lot about weather.
Today, such birds are used more for racing. The owners often lose interest in an individual bird after about a year, heading back to the market in search of a new champion. This provides Spanish breeders a lucrative source of income.
A new series of graphic novels called Ignited tackles the topic of mass shootings in the United States. It tells the fictional but tragically familiar story of 6 teenagers who survive a shooting at their high school in Arizona. More in this report. Written by Marvel's Mark Waid and DC's Kwanzaa Oseifo, Ignited takes on the politically controversial topic of mass shootings in the United States.
Ignited is a story of a bunch of high school kids who have survived a school shooting and have subsequently been ignited. And now they have powers and abilities with the ability to shove back and push back against the forces and the politicians and the social people who have, the neo-Nazis or whatever, caused this sort of reaction.
But the series isn't your typical superhero fare. Ignited's first few issues discuss gun control, immigration and police brutality.
The
topic is a little hard at the beginning because it talks about mass shootings, mass murders, which are specific to the United States. It's not really common elsewhere, but there are a lot here. There's more gun violence in the United States than any other industrialized country. Its civilians are also considered the most heavily armed in the world. And as of the 1st of September, there have been a total of 283 mass shootings in the States in 2019 alone. The Electric Cinema in Notting Hill, London has screened a real-life documentary called The Elephant Queen, and it's on African animals. The film delivers drama and emotion on the life of elephant herds across the Kenyan savannah. More in this report.
The film follows the story of Athena and her offspring as they face challenges along their trek to the dry season refuge. From intimate shots beneath the feet of the giant beasts to underground footage, the movie leaves viewers in awe of the animals. The magnificent images showed directors Victoria Stone and Mark Diebel's skills to capture amazing moments.
We set out to tell a story that would make the world fall in love with elephants, because we're losing elephants fast and we need to save them.
It took both directors 4 years to make the film.
I mean, the whole idea was it's about making people engage emotionally with elephants, because we feel that unless you react and relate to them on an emotional level, then people aren't going to be concerned about their plight.
The UK's naturalist David Attenborough, Britain's Princess Beatrice, and other celebrities attended the screening of the new film.
The Elephant Queen.
Now, the United States has sent its first all-female expedition into space. This much-anticipated milestone for NASA was achieved during a mission to swap faulty batteries on the International Space Station. More in this report.
US astronauts Christina Koch and Jessica Meir made history as they stepped outside the International Space Station. Both clad in white spacesuits and tied by cords to the station some 408 kilometers above Earth, walked to help condition energy stored from the station's solar panels. US President Donald Trump talked to the astronauts amid mission.
Congratulations, Christina and Jessica, on this historic event. This is truly historic. And you're right now on television all over the world, so don't get nervous.
The mission lasted 5 hours. Friday's spacewalk, formally called extravehicular activities, is in line with the US Space Agency's aim to ramp up inclusivity in space.
We hope that we can provide an inspiration to everybody, not only women, but to everybody that has a dream, that has a big dream, and that is willing to work hard to make that dream come true.
Astronaut Koch is scheduled to complete the longest single space flight by a woman by remaining in orbit around the station until February 2020.
Well, we'll be back with news from the world of business and sports right after this short break. Hello and welcome back. Now in business news, China and the US say work on a mini trade deal is going well and they expect it to be signed next month. Speaking in Nanchang, Vice Premier Liu He said China will work with the US to address each other's concerns on the basis of equality and mutual respect. Liu said that stopping the trade war between China and the US would be good for both sides and the global economy. President Donald Trump also expressed optimism that the deal would be signed when he meets his Chinese counterpart next month.
done, subject to getting it signed, and I think it will get signed quite easily, hopefully by the summit in Chile, where President Xi and I will both be.
France, Germany and Italy have joined forces to block the launch of Facebook's digital currency Libra in the European Union. French Economy Minister Bruno Le Maire said the three major EU economies would soon take steps to show Libra is unwelcome in Europe. Le Maire said the digital currency poses a threat to national security because it could affect foreign exchange markets. The G20 also opposed Facebook's digital currency, saying it carried serious risks of money laundering and fraud. Well, it's 27 degrees here in Lahore, but let's take a look at the weather around the world. Well, that's all from me and the team here in Lahore, but we'll be back at the top of the hour with the headlines. I'll leave you with what we say in Pakistan as bye-bye, Allah Hafiz.